This talk was given by Roshi Martin, guiding teacher of the Endless Path Zendo, a lay Buddhist community in Rochester, New York. Join our practice, in person or online, at endlesspathzendo.org.
Today is Saturday, June 8th, 2024, and this morning I'd like to do something a little different. There's a story that has meant a great deal to me for many years. I first came across it when I was a kid, really. It's one of Kipling's stories from the Jungle Books, The Miracle of Purun Bhagat. And I think you'll see why we're going to use that today and how we're going to use it. Especially with Sesshin coming up on Wednesday night, it has to do with the whole issue of renunciation and how that relates to lay life, which is quite different from monastic style and monastic atmosphere. So let's jump right into it and look at lay Zen practice and this old story. What seems most central to me as a teacher of Zen, if we can say there is such a thing, is to make it clear that Zen's purpose is to help us grow. Hold on a sec. Let me just get that. Zen's purpose is to help us grow up and mature from a self-centered life to a hopefully much less self-centered one. So Zen is not about taking on Asian trappings and so on. Instead, its whole point is to help us mature as human beings, just as we are, exactly as we are. That's the essence of what we're doing in practicing Zen. A good part of my job, then, is a matter of doing what I can to, one, help make that clear, and two, to help such maturing actually happen in a Zen student's life. My personal 3 pillars of Zen are showing up, waking up, growing up. Showing up to the practice, waking up through the practice and in the practice, and growing up, maturing in one's life as a human being. Dogen is my touchstone. I quote, to study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be realized by all things. This selfless practice realization continues endlessly. It's not a matter of, yes, I've got it, now I don't have to do that anymore. It's that selfless practice continues endlessly. Presently, my favorite Zen quote is from Ikkyu, Zen Master Ikkyu, the iconoclast and brilliant teacher. When I tried to remember, I always forgot. But once I forgot, I never forget. When I tried to remember, I always forgot. But once I forgot, I never forget. Further, while my faith resides in the koan curriculum as a way of helping us mature, this maturing is not going to happen automatically. It requires a sincere, steady giving of oneself to it. And foundational to all of this is breath practice, counting and or experiencing breath, and the scrupulous honesty, as well as the settling and opening that in time happens with this. So I do not discount breath practice. It is both a necessary and beneficial practice in itself, as well as the source of ongoing koan practice. The two are allied. Please keep that in mind for all of what's going to follow in this talk. So, how do we actually live the daily challenge of lay Zen practice, householder practice, non-monastic style practice? In a traditional culture, there was a sequence. Renunciation was not inaction, but fulfillment of action, a completion of a life. Our task is more complex. Our challenge is to be home leavers without leaving home, which is how Aitken Roshi put it. We've awakened to impermanence and to injustice. We can clearly see the many potential threats now poised like a wave to crash down on life on Earth, on species, on hard-won democratic processes. And we have come to this anxiety-producing awareness while engaged in living our lives. The Buddha awoke to all that is really on our plates as human beings when he was still young. 29 years of age is what traditional sources say. But living in a traditional culture, there was a path for him to then follow. Renounce worldliness, leave home, meditate, which is what he did. Doing this while young was the opening of a revolutionary path. Traditionally, such a path usually began later in life. His path was fulfilled some 6 years later by unsurpassable perfect enlightenment, and then turned into a lifetime of practice as teaching. But our direly chaotic, interwoven and internetted times have pushed us forward so that, like the Buddha, we've seen enough to start rather young, but often while we are in the thick, or actually has to be often if we're young, while still in the thick of earning livings, establishing careers, raising families, caring for parents, maintaining friendships and relationships, and being concerned national as well as global citizens. This is the challenge facing us as lay practitioners today. It is rather unique. We're not monastics. We're not isolated from the world. We don't strive to imitate the Buddha who literally left home. And remember, when he did so, he had resources, so his wife and newborn child were well cared for, not simply abandoned to fend for themselves. But our challenge is to be fully human, to live fully, even as we enter the path of practice. So for us, living fully must now also mean living wisely and compassionately. In the official annals of Zen, this was done by lay people in the past, men and women both, but they were something of rarities, either unusually gifted or unusually motivated. And when you think about it, it may turn out that these two things are exactly the same thing: unusually motivated, unusually gifted. But now lay practice is typically the norm of Zen practice in the West. It is our norm. The danger here is that such Zen practice can become just a nice sort of meditation practice, offering some calm, which is a good thing, don't get me wrong. Greater social cause engagement, also a good thing, but without actual realization, without genuine awakening to intimacy. Instead, we end up with nicer identities in this world. In short, we are Buddhists. But the path of the Bodhisattva means awakening beyond the conditioning of the world, waking up to our real birthright of selfless intimacy with all things living and non-living. This is the core. This is how Avalokiteshvara, Bodhisattva of limitless compassion, has those 1,000 arms. She, he, they has all those arms precisely because he, she, they have none at all. Form is emptiness, emptiness form. The Buddha said something to the effect that in my 50 years of teaching, I've given countless teishos, yet I have not uttered a single word. Many Zen discussions these days seem to be trying to reinvent the wheel, asking if real practice realization is possible for lay practitioners, while aiming also to make the point that lay practice is not secondary to monastic practice, and so is not a lesser form. But at Endless Path Zendo, we've assumed this from the start. Personally, I actually see lay practice as the best form of practice if our aim is to truly mature as whole human beings. And this is indeed what I take Zen to be really about. It is not fundamentally about the lovely forms, the haircuts, liturgy, robes, and so on. Lay practice is its own beast, and it is primary, precisely because in lay life we are never off the fundamental human hook. Forget titles. Forget grades and hierarchies. How are you doing in your life is the question. How are you doing in your practice? How are you doing with your living, with your mistakes, with your anxiety, with your challenges, and with your inescapable aging? Let us let go of being Buddhists and work to become Buddhas, awakened or awakening human beings. Awakened from what? From the false, because partial, and so terribly limiting sense of reality we have come to unconsciously and habitually and self-centeredly accept as me, myself, and I, isolated and alone. What remains hard about lay practice is the challenge of plumbing the depths. We have little support for us to make our efforts. We are not in a monastery surrounded by others doing and looking the same as ourselves. Our world is complex and demanding. But if we just go along with the flow of life as it is and has been for us, just accede to, oh, it feels okay to me as a way of life. Let me remind you of what the poet Robert Bly said in a workshop I did with him many years ago. A great little quote. He said, if we just go with the flow, we'll always end up in the bleeping Gulf of Mexico. And he didn't use bleeping. If we just go with the flow, we always end up in the bleeping Gulf of Mexico. That is, if we just go with our old habitual habits, that flow will carry us right back to the same old places we've already had quite enough of and are trying to mature beyond. In Zen, the image of the carp leaping upstream against the flow to become the dragon it has always been reminds us that there are times we must dig in and go against that flow. Not willfully, not sticking our tongues out at it, but we must take a leap up, which paradoxically really means letting go. Leonard Cohen has a great line in one of his songs. You lose your grip, and then you slip into the masterpiece. Letting go. You lose your grip, and then you slip into the masterpiece. To do this, to move beyond the unconscious force of habit while living our own sort of life is no easy task. So lay practice requires a willingness on our part to carve out space in our lives, which means time, to let everything, and I mean everything, for a time, go. So we can really totally sink into this koan, into this very breath. This is what rounds of formal zazen and what sesshin, which means to touch the mind, it's a Japanese word, itself are really all about. They are opportunities. For without such commitment, Zen is an add-on and a good, but essentially shallow, non-transformative path of niceness. But in such on-again, off-again practice, there are no challenges, no frightful abysses, no blood-drinking demons or issues we must face, no blood, sweat, and tears on the mat, no terrors, and so no piercing joys. In short, no dragons. The genius of committed practice, especially koan practice, is to save us from this. In such practice, our real life is always on the line. Additionally, in koan practice, we repeatedly face the risk of failure. But let's remember, without struggle, there's no perseverance. Without fear, there's no courage. Without failure, there's no success. Without urgency, sometimes meaning anxiety, there can be little motivation to proceed further. And self-satisfaction is rather dull. Rose and I have always practiced as lay people. That's how we began, and that's how we've proceeded in our practice. But as lay people, we did a lot of sitting, faced a lot of challenging doksan, and sat many full 7-day sesshin, all while being married, working, raising a family. And when we each received ordination, we did so as lay ordinees. We did lay ordination. So we don't wonder at all as to whether genuine lay practice is possible. Is it possible to awake to your own mind? Of course it is. Will it take work and persistence and courage? Sure. The essence of renunciation, of seeing through the world, is worked out traditionally and literally in this story by Kipling, which he wrote back in maybe 1894 or so, and he put in his second Jungle Book. As I love that story and have been looking for years for a way to make use of it in teisho, I'm slipping it in now. It may not clearly illumine the core of how we're to do this while still living lives of commitment to family and work and citizenship and Zen practice, but it will remind us of what that core traditionally feels like. And as this coming Wednesday night is the start of sesshin, I thought looking at renunciation, letting go of what we think we are and the world we've created, no matter how good it is, would be a nice way to begin stepping towards sesshin. So let me bring up the story, The Miracle of Purun Bhagat, from Kipling, and I'll read it to you. It begins with a poem, which is the dirge of the langurs. They're kinds of monkeys, large monkeys in India. The night we felt the earth would move, we stole and plucked him by the hand. Because we loved him with the love that knows, but cannot understand. So these are monkeys speaking in this poem. And when the roaring hillside broke and all our world fell down in rain, we saved him, we the little folk, but lo, he does not come again. Mourn now we saved him for the sake of such poor love as wild ones may. Mourn ye, our brother will not wake, and his own kind drives us away. That's the monkey's take on what happened. So here's the story. There was once a man in India who was prime minister of one of the semi-independent native states in the northwestern part of the country. He was a Brahmin, so high caste that caste ceased to have any particular meaning for him. And his father had been an important official in the gay-colored tag-rag and bobtail of an old-fashioned Hindu court. But as Purun Das grew up, he felt that the old order of things was changing, and that if anyone wished to get on in the world, he must stand well with the English and imitate all that the English believed to be good. At the same time, a native official must keep his own master's favor. This was a difficult game, but the quiet, closed-mouthed young Brahmin, helped by a good English education at a Bombay university, played it coolly and rose, step by step, to be prime minister of the kingdom. That is to say, he held more real power than his master, the Maharaja. When the old king, who was suspicious of the English, their railways and telegraphs, died, Purun Das stood high with his young successor, who had been tutored by an Englishman, and between them, though he always took care that his master should have the credit, they established schools for little girls, made roads and started state dispensaries and shows of agricultural implements, and published a yearly blue book on the moral and material progress of the state, and the Foreign Office and the government of India were delighted. Very few native states take up English progress altogether, for they will not believe, as Purun Das showed he did, that what was good for the Englishman must be twice as good for the Asiatic. The prime minister became the honored friend of viceroys and governors and lieutenant governors and medical missionaries and common missionaries and hard-riding English officers who came to shoot in the state preserves, as well as of whole hosts of tourists who traveled up and down India in the cold weather, showing how things ought to be managed. In his spare time, he would endow scholarships for the study of medicine and manufactures on strictly English lines, and write letters to the Pioneer, the greatest Indian daily paper, explaining his master's aims and objects. At last he went to England on a visit and had to pay enormous sums to the priests when he came back, for even so high caste a Brahmin as Purun Das lost caste by crossing the Black Sea. In London he met and talked with everyone worth knowing, men whose names go all over the world, and saw a great deal more than he said. He was given honorary degrees by learned universities, and he made speeches and talked of Hindu social reform to English ladies in evening dress, till all London cried, "This is the most fascinating man we have ever met at dinner since cloths were first laid." When he returned to India, there was a blaze of glory, for the Viceroy himself made a special visit to confer upon the Maharaja the Grand Cross of the Star of India, all diamonds and ribbons and enamel. And at the same ceremony, while the cannon boomed, Purun Das was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the Indian Empire, so that his name stood Sir Purun Das, K.C.I.E., Knight Commander of the Order of the Indian Empire. That evening at dinner in the big vice-regal tent, he stood up with the badge and the collar of the order on his breast, and replying to the toast of his master's health, made a speech few Englishmen could have bettered. Next month, when the city had returned to its sun-baked quiet, he did a thing no Englishman would have dreamed of doing, for so far as the world's affairs went, he died. The jeweled order of his knighthood went back to the Indian government, and a new prime minister was appointed to the charge of affairs, and a great game of general post, Game of Thrones, we might say, began in all the subordinate appointments. The priests knew what had happened, and the people guessed. But India is the one place in the world where a man can do as he pleases, and nobody asks why. And the fact that Dewan Sir Purun Das, K.C.I.E., had resigned position, palace, and power, and taken up the begging bowl and ochre-colored dress of a sannyasi, or holy man, was considered nothing extraordinary. He had been, as the old law recommends, 20 years a youth, 20 years a fighter, though he had never carried a weapon in his life, and 20 years head of a household. He had used his wealth and his power for what he knew both to be worth. He had taken honor when it came his way. He had seen men in cities far and near, and men in cities had stood up and honored him. Now he would let those things go, as a man drops the cloak he no longer needs. Behind him as he walked through the city gates, an antelope skin and brass-handled crutch under his arm, and a begging bowl of polished brown coco de mer, that's coconut, in his hand, barefoot, alone, with eyes cast on the ground. Behind him they were firing salutes from the bastions of honor, in honor of his happy successor. Purun Das nodded. All that life was ended, and he bore it no more ill will or good will than a man bears to a colorless dream of the night. He was a sannyasi, a homeless, wandering mendicant, depending on his neighbors for his daily bread. And so long as there is a morsel to divide in India, neither priest nor beggar starves. He had never in his life tasted meat, and very seldom eaten even fish. A 5-pound note would have covered his personal expenses for food through any one of the many years in which he had been absolute master of millions of money. Even when he was being lionized in London, he had held before him his dream of peace and quiet, the long, white, dusty Indian road, printed all over with bare feet, the incessant, slow-moving traffic, and the sharp-smelling wood smoke curling up under the fig trees in the twilight, where the wayfarers sit at their evening meal. When the time came to make that dream true, the Prime Minister took the proper steps, and in 3 days you might have more easily found a bubble in the trough of the long Atlantic seas than Purun Das among the roving, gathering, separating millions of India. At night his antelope skin was spread where the darkness overtook him, sometimes in a sannyasi monastery by the roadside, sometimes by a mud pillar shrine of Kalapir, where the yogis, who are another misty division of holy men, would receive him as they do who know what castes and divisions are worth. Sometimes on the outskirts of a little Hindu village where the children would steal up with food their parents had prepared, and sometimes on the pitch of the bare grazing grounds where the flame of his stick fire waked the drowsy camels. It was all one to Purun Das, or Purun Bhagat, as he called himself now. Earth, people, and food were all one. But unconsciously his feet drew him away northward and eastward, from the south to Rohtak, from Rohtak to Kurnool, from Kurnool to ruined Samana, and then upstream along the dried bed of the Gugger River that fills only when the rain falls in the hills, till one day he saw the far line of the great Himalayas. Then Purun Bhagat smiled, for he remembered that his mother was of Rajput Brahmin birth from Kuluway, a hill woman, always homesick for the snows, and that the least touch of hill blood draws a man in the end back to where he belongs. Yonder, said Purun Bhagat, breasting the lower slopes of the Siwaliks, where the cacti stood up like 7-branched candlesticks, yonder I shall sit down and get knowledge. And the cool wind of the Himalayas whistled about his ears as he trod the road that led to Simla. The last time he had come that way it had been in state, with a clattering cavalry escort, to visit the gentlest and most affable of viceroys, and the two had talked for an hour together about mutual friends in London and what the Indian common folk really thought of things. This time Purun Bhagat paid no calls, but leaned on the rail of the mall, watching that glorious view of the plains spread out 40 miles below, till a native Mohammedan policeman told him he was obstructing traffic, and Purun Bhagat salaamed reverently to the law, because he knew the value of it, and was seeking for a law of his own. Then he moved on and slept that night in an empty hut at Chota Simla, which looks like the very last end of the earth, but it was only the beginning of his journey. He followed the Himalaya-Tibet road, the little 10-foot track that is blasted out of solid rock, or strutted out on timbers over gulfs 1,000 feet deep, that dips into warm, wet, shut-in valleys and climbs out across bare, grassy hill shoulders where the sun strikes like a burning glass, or turns through dripping, dark forests where the tree ferns dress the trunks from head to heel and the pheasant calls to his mate. And he met Tibetan herdsmen with their dogs and flocks of sheep, each sheep with a little bag of borax on his back, and wandering woodcutters and cloaked and blanketed lamas from Tibet, coming into India on pilgrimage, and envoys of little solitary hill states, posting furiously on ring-streaked and piebald ponies, or the cavalcade of a Raja paying a visit, or else for a long, clear day he would see nothing more than a black bear grunting and rooting below in the valley. When he first started, the roar of the world he had left still rang in his ears as the roar of a tunnel rings long after the train has passed through. But when he had put the Mutiani Pass behind him, that was all done, and Purun Bhagat was alone with himself, walking, wondering and thinking, his eyes on the ground and his thoughts with the clouds. One evening he crossed the highest pass he had met till then. It had been a 2 days climb and came out on a line of snow peaks that banded all the horizon, mountains from 15 to 20,000 feet high, looking almost near enough to hit with a stone, though they were 50 or 60 miles away. The pass was crowned with dense dark forest, deodar, walnut, wild cherry, wild olive, and wild pear, but mostly deodar, which is the Himalayan cedar, and under the shadow of the deodars stood a deserted shrine to Kali, who is Durga, who is Sitala, who is sometimes worshipped against the smallpox. Purun Das swept the stone floor clean, smiled at the grinning statue, made himself a little mud fireplace at the back of the shrine, spread his antelope skin on a bed of fresh pine needles, tucked his brass-handled crutch under his armpit, and sat down to rest. Immediately below him, the hillside fell away, clean and cleared for 1,500 feet, where a little village of stone-walled houses with roofs of beaten earth clung to the steep tilt. All round it, the tiny terraced fields lay out like aprons of patchwork on the knees of the mountain, and cows no bigger than beetles grazed between the smooth stone circles of the threshing floors. Looking across the valley, the eye was deceived by the size of things, and could not at first realize that what seemed to be low scrub on the opposite mountain flank was in truth a forest of 100-foot pines. Purun Bhagat saw an eagle swoop across the gigantic hollow, but the great bird dwindled to a dot ere it was halfway over. A few bands of scattered clouds strung up and down the valley, catching on a shoulder of the hills, or rising up and dying out when they were level with the head of the pass. And here shall I find peace, said Purun Bhagat. Now, a hillman makes nothing of a few 100 feet up or down, and as soon as the villagers saw the smoke in the deserted shrine, the village priest climbed up the terraced hillside to welcome the stranger. When he met Purun Bhagat's eyes, the eyes of a man used to control thousands, he bowed to the earth, took the begging bowl without a word, and returned to the village, saying, "We have at last a holy man. Never have I seen such a man. He is of the plains, but pale-colored, a Brahmin of the Brahmins." Then all the housewives of the village said, "Think you he will stay with us?" And each did her best to cook the most savory meal for the Bhagat. Hill food is very simple, but with buckwheat and Indian corn and rice and red pepper, and little fish out of the stream in the valley, and honey from the flue-like hives built in the stone walls, and dried apricots and turmeric and wild ginger and bannocks of flour. A devout woman can make good things, and it was a full bowl that the priest carried to the Bhagat. Was he going to stay? Asked the priest. Would he need a chela, a disciple, to beg for him? Had he a blanket against the cold weather? Was the food good? Purun Bhagat ate and thanked the giver. It was in his mind to stay. That was sufficient, said the priest. Let the begging bowl be placed outside the shrine, in the hollow made by those two twisted roots, and daily should the Bhagat be fed, for the village felt honored that such a man, he looked timidly into the Bhagat's face, should tarry among them. That day saw the end of Purun Bhagat's wanderings. He had come to the place appointed for him, the silence and the space. After this, time stopped, and he, sitting at the mouth of the shrine, could not tell whether he was alive or dead, a man with control of his limbs, or a part of the hills and the clouds, and the shifting rain and sunlight. He would repeat a name softly to himself 100 times, till at each repetition he seemed to move more and more out of his body, sweeping up to the doors of some tremendous discovery. But just as the door was opening, his body would drag him back, and with grief he felt he was locked up again in the flesh and bones of Purun Bhagat. Every morning he filled the filled begging bowl was laid silently in the crutch of the roots outside the shrine. Sometimes the priest bought it, sometimes a Ladakhi trader lodging in the village and anxious to get merit trudged up the path, But more often it was the woman who had cooked the meal overnight, and she would murmur, hardly above her breath, "Speak for me before the gods, Bhagat. Speak for such a one, the wife of so-and-so." Now and then some bold child would be allowed the honor, and Purun Bhagat would hear him drop the bowl and run as fast as his little legs could carry him. But the Bhagat never came down to the village. It was laid out like a map at his feet. He could see the evening gatherings, could see the wonderful unnamed green of the young rice, the indigo blues of the Indian corn, the dock-like patches of buckwheat, and in its season the red bloom of the amaranth, whose tiny seeds, being neither grain nor pulse, make a food that can be lawfully eaten by Hindus in time of fasts. When the year turned, the roofs of the huts were all little squares of purest gold, for it was on the roofs that they laid out their cobs of the corn to dry. Hiving and harvest, rice sowing and husking, passed before his eyes, all embroidered down there on the many-sided plots of fields, and he thought of them all and wondered what they all led to at the long last. Even in populated India, a man cannot a day sit still before the wild things run over him as though he were a rock. And in that wilderness very soon the wild things who knew Kali's shrine well came back to look at the intruder. The langurs, the big gray-whiskered monkeys of the Himalayas, were naturally the first, for they are alive with curiosity. And when they had upset the begging bowl and rolled it round the floor and tried their teeth on the brass-handled crutch and made faces at the antelope skin, they decided that the human being who sat so still was harmless. At evening, they would leap down from the pines and beg with their hands for things to eat and then swing off in graceful curves. They liked the warmth of the fire, too, and huddled round it till Purun Bhagat had to push them aside to throw on more fuel. And in the morning, as often as not, he would find a furry ape sharing his blanket. All day long, one or other of the tribe would sit by his side, staring out at the snows, crooning and looking unspeakably wise and sorrowful. After the monkeys came the barasingh, that big deer, which is like our red deer but stronger. He wished to rub off the velvet of his horns against the cold stones of Kali's statue and stamped his feet when he saw the man at the shrine. But Purun Bhagat never moved, and little by little the royal stag edged up and nuzzled his shoulder. Purun Bhagat slid one cool hand along the hot antlers, and the touch smoothed the fretted beast who bowed his head. And Purun Bhagat very softly rubbed and ravelled off the velvet. Afterward the barasingh brought his doe and fawn, gentle things that mumbled on the holy man's blanket or would come alone at night, his eyes green in the fire flicker to take his share of fresh walnuts. At last the musk deer, the shyest and almost the smallest of the deerlets, came too, her big rabbit ears erect. Even brindled, silent Mushik Naba must needs find out what the light in the shrine meant and drop out her moose-like nose into Purun Bhagat's lap, coming and going with the shadows of the fire. Purun Bhagat called them all my brothers, and his low call of "Bahai, Bahai" would draw them from the forest at noon, if they were within earshot. The Himalayan black bear, moody and suspicious, Sona, who has the V-shaped white mark under his chin, passed that way more than once, and since the Bhagat showed no fear, Sona showed no anger, but watched him and came closer and begged a share of the caresses and a dole of bread or wild berries. Often in the still dawns, when the Bhagat would climb to the very crest of the pass to watch the red day walking along the peaks of the snows, he would find Sona shuffling and grunting at his heels, thrusting a curious forepaw under fallen trunks and bringing it away with a woof of impatience. Or his early steps would wake Sona where he lay curled up, and the great brute, rising erect, would think to fight till he heard the Bhagat's voice and knew his best friend. Nearly all hermits and holy men who live apart from the big cities have the reputation of being able to work miracles with the wild things, But all the miracle lies in keeping still, in never making a hasty movement, and for a long time at least, in never looking directly at a visitor. The villagers saw the outline of the Barasingh stalking like a shadow through the dark forest behind the shrine, saw the Minau, the Himalayan pheasant, blazing in her best colors before Kali's statue, and the langurs on their haunches inside playing with the walnut shells. Some of the children, too, had heard Sona singing to himself bear fashion behind the fallen rocks, and the Bhagat's reputation as miracle worker stood firm. Yet nothing was farther from his mind than miracles. He believed that all things were one big miracle, and when a man knows that much, he knows something to go upon. He knew for a certainty that there was nothing great and nothing little in this world, and day and night he strove to think out his way into the heart of things, back to the place whence his soul had come. So thinking, his untrimmed hair fell down about his shoulders. The stone slab at the side of the antelope skin was dented into a little hole by the foot of his brass-handled crutch, and the place between the tree trunks where the begging bowl rested day after day sunk and wore into a hollow almost as smooth as the brown shell itself, and each beast knew his exact place at the fire. The fields changed their colors with the seasons. The threshing floors filled and emptied, and filled again and again and again and again. When winter came, the langurs frisked among the branches, feathered with light snow, till the mother monkeys brought their sad-eyed little babies up from the warmer valleys with the spring. There were few changes in the village. The priest was older, and many of the little children who used to come with the begging dish sent their own children now. And when you asked of the villagers how long their holy man had lived in Kali's shrine at the head of the pass, they answered, always. Then came such summer rains had not been known in the hills for many seasons. Through 3 good months the valley was wrapped in cloud and soaking mist, steady, unrelenting downfall, breaking off into thunder shower after thunder shower. Kali's shrine stood above the clouds for the most part, and there was a whole month in which the Bhagat never caught a glimpse of his village. It was packed away under a white floor of cloud that swayed and shifted and rolled on itself and bulged upward, but never broke from its piers the streaming flanks of the valley. All that time he heard nothing but the sound of 1,000,000 little waters overhead from the trees and underfoot along the ground, soaking through the pine needles, dripping from the tongues of draggled fern, and spouting in newly torn muddy channels down the slopes. Then the sun came out and drew forth the good incense of the deodars and the rhododendrons, and that far-off clean smell which the hill people call the smell of the snows. The hot sunshine lasted for a week, and then the rains gathered together for their last downpour, and the water fell in sheets that flayed off the skin of the ground and leapt back in mud. Purun Bhagat heaped his fire high that night, for he was sure his brothers would need warmth. But never a beast came to the shrine, though he called and called till he dropped asleep, wondering what had happened in the woods. It was in the black heart of the night, the rain drumming like 1,000 drums, that he was roused by a plucking at his blanket, and stretching out felt the little hand of a langur. "It is better here than in the trees," he said sleepily, loosening a folded blanket. "Take it and be warm." The monkey caught his hand and pulled hard. "Is it food then?" said Purun Bhagat. "Wait a while, and I will prepare some." As he kneeled to throw fuel on the fire, the langur ran to the door of the shrine, crooned, and ran back again, plucking at the man's knee. "What is it? What is thy trouble, brother?" said Purun Bhagat, for the langur's eyes were full of things he could not tell. Unless one of thy casts be in a trap, and none set traps here, I will not go into that weather. Look, brother, even the barasingh comes for shelter. The deer's antlers clashed as he strode into the shrine, clashed against the grinning statue of Kali. He lowered them in Purun Bhagat's direction and stamped uneasily, hissing through half-shut nostrils. "Hi, hi, hi," said the Bhagat, snapping his fingers. "Is this payment for a night's lodging?" But the deer pushed him toward the door, and as he did so, Purun Bhagat heard the sound of something opening with a sigh, and saw two slabs of the floor draw away from each other, while the sticky earth below smacked its lips. "Now I see," said Purun Bhagat. "No blame to my brothers that he did not sit by the fire tonight. The mountain is falling. And yet, why should I go?" His eye fell on the empty begging bowl, and his face changed. "They have given me good food daily since I came. And if I am not swift tomorrow, there will not be one mouth in the valley. Indeed, I must go and warn them below. Back there, brother. Let me get to the fire." The barasingh backed unwillingly as Purun Bhagat drove a pine torch deep into the flame, twirling it till it was well lit. "Ah! You came to warn me," he said, rising. "Better than that we shall do. Better than that. Out now. And lend me thy neck, brother, for I have but 2 feet. He clutched the bristling withers of the barasingh with his right hand, held the torch away with his left, and stepped out of the shrine into the desperate night. There was no breath of wind, but the rain nearly drowned the fire as the great deer hurried down the slope, sliding on his haunches. As soon as they were clear of the forest moor, the Bhagat's brothers joined him. He heard though he could not see, the langurs pressing against him, and behind them the of Sana. The rain matted his long white hair into ropes. The water splashed beneath his bare feet, and his yellow robe clung to his frail old body. But he stepped down steadily, leaning against the barasingh. He was no longer a holy man, but Sir Purun Das, KCIE, Prime Minister of no small state, a man accustomed to command, going out to save life. Down the steep, plashy path they poured all together, the Bhagat and his brothers, down and down, till the feet clicked and stumbled on the wall of a threshing floor, and he snorted because he smelt man. Now they were at the head of the one crooked village street, and the Bhagat beat with his crutch on the barred windows of the blacksmith's house. As his torch blazed up in the shelter of these, "Up and out!" cried Purun Bhagat, and he did not know his own voice, for it was years since he had spoken aloud to a man. "The hill falls! The hill is falling! Up and out, oh, you within!" "It is our Bhagat," said the blacksmith's wife. "He stands among his beasts. Gather the little ones and give the call." It ran from house to house, while the beasts, cramped in the narrow way, surged and huddled around the Bhagat, and Sana puffed impatiently. The people hurried into the street. There were no more than 70 souls, all told. And in the glare of the torches they saw their Bhagat holding back the terrified barasingh, while the monkeys plucked piteously at his skirts, and Sana sat on his haunches and roared. "Across the valley and up the next hill," shouted Purun Bhagat. "Leave none behind, we follow." Then the hill people ran as only hill folk can run, for they knew that in a landslip you must climb for the highest ground across the valley. They fled, splashing through the little river at the bottom, and panted up the terraced fields on the far side, while the Bhagat and his brethren followed. Up and up the opposite mountain they climbed, calling to each other by name, the roll call of the village, and at their heels toiled the big barasingh, weighted by the failing strength of Purun Bhagat. At last the deer stopped in the shadow of a deep pine wood 500 feet up the hillside. His instinct had warned him of the coming slide, now told him he would be safe here. Purun Bhagat dropped fainting by his side, for the chill of the rain and that fierce climb were killing him. But first he called to the scattered torches ahead, "Stay and count your numbers." Then whispering to the deer, as he saw the lights gather in a cluster, "Stay with me, brother. stay till I go. There was a sigh in the air that grew to a mutter, and a mutter that grew to a roar, and a roar that passed all sense of hearing, and the hillside on which the villagers stood was hit in the darkness and rocked to the blow. Then a note, as steady, deep, and true as the deep sea of the organ, drowned everything for perhaps 5 minutes, while the very roots of the pines quivered to it. It died away, and the sound of the rain falling on miles of hard ground and grass changed to the muffled drum of water on soft earth. That told its own tale. Never a villager, not even the priest, was bold enough to speak to the Bhagat who had saved their lives. They crouched under the pines and waited till the day. When it came, they looked across the valley and saw what had been forest and terraced field and track-threaded grazing ground was one raw, red, fan-shaped smear with a few trees flung head down on the scarp. That red ran high up the hill of their refuge, damming back the little river which had begun to spread into a brick-colored lake of the village, of the road to the shrine, of the shrine itself, and the forest behind. There was no trace. For 1 mile in width and 2,000 feet in sheer depth, the mountainside had come away bodily, planed clean from head to heel. And the villagers, one by one, crept through the wood to pray before their Bhagat. They saw the Barasingh standing over him, who fled when they came near, and they heard the langurs wailing in the branches and Sona moaning up the hill. But their Bhagat was dead, sitting cross-legged, his back against a tree, his crutch under his armpit, and his face turned to the northeast. The priest said, "Behold a miracle after a miracle, for in this very attitude must all sannyasis be buried. Therefore, where he now is, we will build the temple to our holy man." They built the temple before a year was ended, a little stone and earth shrine, and they called the hill the Bhagat's Hill, and they worship there with lights and flowers and offerings to this day. But they do not know that the saint of their worship is the late Sir Purun Das, KCIE, DCL, PhD, etc., once Prime Minister of the progressive and enlightened state of Mohunwala, and honorary or corresponding member of more learned and scientific societies than will ever do any good in this world or the next. So a little story about letting go of all the things we think we are and all the gains we think we have, how passing is this very life. Impermanence struck the Buddha terribly at the age of 29, and he followed Purun Bhagat's path and went off at a young age, which was quite unusual, to do this very same thing, to get to the very root of it. Our challenge as lay people is to do that very same thing, not to trivialize it or shallow it, to do that very same thing, to get to the very root of it, in the midst of creating meaningful lives, being good citizens of this planet, good citizens of this country, good parents, good children, good people in the work we do. This is an immense challenge, not an easy one. Coming together to practice together, to do sesshin together, to do formal zazen together, is an immense help handed down by our ancestors in Zen tradition, which really make lay Zen practice realization possible for us today. So, endless gratitude. I look forward to seeing you all again quite soon. We'll stop here and recite our great vows for all.